it's a deep cut. It's super meta, right? Because the real chords of how Jupiter's Legacy work really have its foundations in the Ultimates run that Miller did with Brian Hitch, which of course is just the ultimate version of the Avengers. So it's a super meta dive on that one.
It's funny because I didn't quite think of it as being an Avengers story. You know what I mean? Like an Avengers trip.
Mm-hmm.
I actually thought it.
Go ahead. I'm recording. We got content here. Go ahead, man.
No, I thought of it as being more fantastic, more sort of a cross between Fantastic Four and Justice League.
I can definitely agree with that. Yeah, it's the way he wrote it. He really kind of cut his teeth on Ultimates writing in that style.
True.
Where normally like Miller is all about the hard hits and the quick, jabs and the funny haha and over the top thing. And this one, he really took his time to build something book wise, and that's something that I think he definitely kind of got from Ultimates, because the legend is that the original, was it 5 issues of Ultimates, that was all supposed to originally happen in the first issue. And somebody editorial was like, why don't we decompress this? And it was one of the smartest things that they've ever done, because basically the entire MCU is built on that, premise and the way that they tell those stories. So it's, yeah.
Okay, so we have already
that for deep dive.
Golden nuggets. No, this is awesome. And we're just going to keep the camera rolling. Welcome to Three Guys and a Story, a podcast in which we three guys, we bring our lived lives together to discuss the same story. So we're not going to tell you what the story is. What we're going to do is just tell you how the story intersects with all three of our different lives and sort of make a bigger meta story out of that, if you like. So I'm your host, Dr. Scott Jordan, aka Zombie Scotty, cognitive psychologist, philosopher from Illinois State University. So today we discuss Mark Miller's graphic novel, published by Image Comics and turned into a Netflix series, Jupiter's Legacy. Gentlemen, please introduce yourselves and tell the audience who you are. And we're going to start with Victor.
Hello, I'm Victor Dandridge, the hardest working man in comics. I am working on gaining, my credentials to be a phenomenological narratologist, because this is a phrase that I learned due to Scott. I'm working on that one. I'm going to put that on the end of my stuff at some point. But I am a huge Mark Miller fan, and I might have read Jupiter's Legacy once or twice. I don't know, maybe. Wait,
always bringing the credit.
Always bringing the credit. Yeah, man. I gotta represent, man.
Well, what I love about it is you're the man who's read everything, right? And then I've seen the show, and I have my vibe on it, and Stanford's had his experiences with it, and I just love the idea of mixing up those different worlds and
you gotta.
Fantastic. How about you, Stanford?
Well, I'm Stanford Carpenter. I am a cultural anthropologist coming to you out of Chicago. I'm ready to share my experiences.
So
let's go.
Yeah, I'm just going to go ahead. Well, Stanford, you said you're ready. Let's just get some of your experiences on the table, and we'll go from there.
Okay. Well, gosh,
I think I know where this is going.
The spotlight, boom. What do you got to? Yeah.
Somebody needs more caffeine this morning.
Yeah.
That happens.
But seriously, personally, I had some ambivalence about how Jupiter's Legacy kind of translates into the present. There are a lot of things in there there actually were a lot of things in there that I liked. But I felt like one thing that's been really interesting about what's been happening with comics is that in the last 20 years, we've just had the succession of comic book translations onto the screen. That it's not that they've been good, but they've been the type that reset the bar, right? Mm-hmm. Or like for example, I mean, people talk a lot about Iron Man #1. like if you look at it sort of like, you know, if you look at it like pre-Iron Man #1 versus post Iron Man #1, it's like there's a whole different standard for what is good. The same thing could be said for the first X-Men movie, right? Before the first X-Men movie and after the X-Men movie. It's like a paradigm shift. And I'm looking at, you know, and before that, you know, I mean, arguably one of the best comics translated to film. You know, you know, people talk about Superman and Batman, but Blade, right?
Yep.
And part of the reason, and you know, part of the reason Blade worked is because he was a C-list character in a third string book. You know, so, and it's not a knock on the character, but it meant that they had freedom to do with the character as they pleased, and they were able to really bring him into the 90s, right?
Right.
So
yeah, because I would also like co-sign on that Blade was a better movie than the comic ever really was.
Yes.
Yeah, I like that.
And you know, I also, I mean, I feel like I'm getting off track here, but I've also always felt that one of the best superhero movies of the 80s was actually Prince's Purple Rain.
Whoa.
Because when I watched that, I realized I could see all of the superhero tropes were in there. Right? This, you know, I mean, there's a dual identity in terms of Prince as the performer versus his life and his relationship to his family. I mean, the costuming on that was amazing, and especially, and I actually it's kind of interesting if you think going all the way back to like you know, the late 60s and early 70s. And the way Black soul music kind of worked its way out. I mean, the costuming, the outfits were just, there was something that was sort of heroic. People make fun of the Legion of Superheroes character Tyrok because he looked like he was a member of Earth, Wind, and Fire. But that's also a backwards saying of Earth, Wind, and Fire. They look like
superheroes, right?
Yeah,
absolutely,
do, man.
And so yeah, I think that Prince. I thought the soundtrack was amazing. His bike.
And by the way,
Maurice
White was a superhero.
Yeah, 100%.
Yes,
was a superhero.
And so yeah, I mean, and I think that, so for me, when I think of like superhero movies in the, you know, going into the 70s and 80s, you know, a lot of that was being worked out there, and ironically, a lot of that energy from Purple Rain was very much a part of Batman. Prince did the soundtrack.
Yep.
You know, so I mean, let as we move forward to today, right? I mean, since Iron Man, I mean, yeah, a lot of the resetting the bars happened within the MCU. Or at least that's what we were saying until HBO came forth with Watchmen, right? And you know, and I think that this is the one area where DC Comics doesn't get enough credit, is that it's not just Watchmen, but DC, as all of this was happening, reset the bar for television with the animated series, right? And then you've got, and you just start carrying that through, but it's as I carry it through in my mind, it is this perpetual, it's not just the movies getting better or worse and backsliding, it's these paradigm shifts, these utter changes of expectations. And I think it's important to understand that in terms of, at least for me, in terms of my reaction to Jupiter's Legacy, because I felt like Jupiter's Legacy, it would have been one of the most amazing experiences if it had been put out before Iron Man #1, or even before Watchmen, right? So, you know, because I felt like it didn't deal as seamlessly with the streaming format. And I think that that's something that we don't talk about enough, is it's not just about telling good stories, it's about translating that story to a format, right? And you know, that's one of the things that I'm noticing, even as I look at at Falcon and Winter Soldier, WandaVision, Loki is that they're still working on figuring out how to work in that streaming format. Watchmen, while it wasn't the streaming format as an HBO miniseries, is kind of in sort of a middle space, but it knew how to work with the unique aspects of its form, like that is coming out once a week, right?
It's funny that you bring up that, because I think there is a correlation between that and the Disney Plus TV shows, that they are trying to capture what Watchmen did by, again, creating that miniseries space that has that weekly release, because Watchmen did it so well.
Yeah.
And they're trying to bring their MCU-ness to that format. And I think that's a very wise observation.
Yeah. And I think what's interesting about the streaming space versus the miniseries space, an HBO miniseries, usually all but one of the episodes are the exact same length, right? And the length is actually determined very much by the broadcast schedule. Whereas streaming, you can have one episode be 23 minutes, the next episode be 48 minutes.
Right.
And that's a challenge, and that creates an interesting challenge in terms of pacing. Because even though each episode you want to have a certain amount of story, you get to decide how long that arc can be. And you can make the mistake of creating a week where the story's too bloated or the story is too compressed.
Yeah.
Right. But Jupiter's Legacy, I mean, in terms of the themes, in the writing, I just felt like we are a little further along than where that show is. If I had watched that show before Watchmen, I would have had a much different reaction than after Watchmen. Same thing if it was before or after Iron Man, right? And the story was written before, if I remember correctly. The story came out before or around the time of Iron Man #1, correct?
Kind of. It's been a while. Let's go to the books and let's find out.
There you go.
Let's see.
I think we call this Wikipedia.
I know. Yeah. No, actually, it looks like this was originally written 2013ish. So we're talking post Avengers, but still in that early, Iron Man 3-ish time period. So
it would see, this would have stacked up really well with the first Avengers film, right? And in some ways, this would have gone further than the first Avengers film, because the first Avengers film does not deal with legacy. It does not deal with it doesn't deal with heroic codes. I mean, that was actually one of the things that struck me about the first Avengers movie, is in the first Avengers movie, and this is something that's weird. In the comics, it kind of sorted itself out differently. But in the first Avengers movie, it's clear that the members of the Avengers have incredibly different codes of conduct.
Yes.
You've got Hawkeye and you've got Black Widow, who are spies, and a spy and an assassin. Right? That's not the same thing as what you expect Captain America, a good soldier, to be, coming at it with. And even in Captain America, Winter Soldier, that was one of the issues, remember?
Right.
He didn't want to be a spy. And he had remember he came into conflict with Black Widow.
Yeah, like, because she was, you're not telling me everything. What are you doing?
Right.
Yeah.
And so I look at all that. I was watching, I'm like, wow, like Hawkeye is essentially a sharpshooter and an assassin. Like, even the way they used him in the first Avengers film, where like he like stood out away from the fight and just started picking characters off, right? And I'm like,
sounds like the D&D Motley Crew.
Yeah,
But it's like with that, he doesn't have a code against killing.
Nope.
And I'm like, and especially to a character like Thor, who doesn't have a problem with killing, but is very honor bound.
Right. If the fight is too mismatched, he's not interested. Like that's wrong to him.
And a lot of the conflicts in the MCU do come from those different codes, right?
Right.
People not being able to agree on what to do.
Civil War as a whole.
Exactly. No, you're
That's
absolutely
exactly
right.
what that is.
Right.
No, you're exactly right.
But I think that in the first Avengers they kind of glossed over that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, that was the first time they got together, right?
Well, there was this assumption of the greater good that permeated everyone, and how you got to that greater good was inconsequential as long as you got to the greater good. That was the point.
I think it was, but it was also like I said, I just had a little difficulty that just stuck out to me as I was watching it in the theater. I'm like, oh, wait a second, like, oh, they're not on the same page here, you know. So imagine a Jupiter's Legacy coming out around then.
Mm-hmm. As a fan of the book series, as much as I am, and when I say I'm a fan, like, Mark is a friend and a mentor. So I've had, you know, deeper conversations about some of these things with him. So I have almost an allegiance to this series that when I saw the show, I was in conflict of sorts. There were parts of it that I truly did not like. Visually speaking, I think you're absolutely right, Stanford. In terms of the visual effects, this would have been great circa Spider-Man 2. In the world that we live in now, post Endgame, the effects weren't up to par for what we expected, and not when a Netflix, you know, feature like Bright has better graphic effects, or, you know, when what this is maybe on par with like season 2 of The Flash. That's not where we are, though. Like, we should be well beyond that in terms of the effects side. Like, we should be seeing stuff where we're like, oh my God, you know, the Mandalorian blows this out in terms of effects.
Let me ask you guys about those effects, because I did have a reaction to them, and it was almost story context dependent. In other words, the special effects of Walt being in Black Star's clone's mind, those were fantastic, I thought. I thought that whole scene was managed incredibly well. It kept up with where we are. And the fights that were going outside in the present, they really felt like I was watching the Hulk from the 70s or something along those lines.
Right.
And I wonder if there was an intentional attempt to get that retro vibe. Because there were plenty of scenes where it looked like they actually kind of flew someone in for a landing. Instead of animating the whole thing, it looked like they actually had them on, you know, cables, and they actually flew them in and filmed it and then CGI'd. And I thought, why would they do that now? So I got a retro feel out of those parts of it. And it felt like maybe they're trying to generate these senses we're having that's now, which very much felt like the 70s, by the way, right? That's the 70s and the 80s. I got to tell you, I dug the Depression era story. I'll talk about that later. That had its own kind of vibe to it. And then when he goes into Black Star's mind, some of the fighting at night I actually thought was good. That had a contemporary special effects vibe. So anyway, I just wonder, do you think any of that was intentional, or do you think my vibe was that it was kind of done that way?
Well, it's hard to say, because we do know that the production was kind of embroiled in some turmoil, because the showrunner, Stephen DeKnight, was either removed or stepped down due to creative differences in the midst of things. I do know that there was a clash in terms of what he wanted to spend budgetarily versus what Netflix wanted to spend. He wanted to spend more money per episode, and Netflix didn't. And obviously, when it comes to the fights, you know, Stephen DeKnight is somebody as the showrunner for Daredevil, right? And we when it comes to like what Stanford was talking about, a elevation of story in a certain context, particularly when it comes to fighting, Daredevil took things to a place where you're like, this is amazing. And
that fight scene in the Russian mob's place, man.
Come on. the hallway, the single shot hallway, one track fight. It became a standard of the Marvel Netflix shows. Like, that's how good that was.
And you know what's also interesting? You know what I also think really did some amazing stuff as far as fight choreography is Black Lightning, the TV show.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things I thought was interesting about the fight choreography in Black Lightning is that they really gave each of the characters very different fighting styles. And you see that the most in the later series where they bring in the last season where they bring in Painkiller. Like Painkiller is like some of the most amazing fight choreography. Then you switch over to Jefferson Pierce and he's just and Jefferson Pierce is you go from the elegance of Painkiller to just the brawling of Jefferson Pierce, right? Like,
right.
You know, and in that sequence, and actually in that season, he actually was doing that cage fighting, right? And I thought that, I actually think that what was interesting about what they did in that evolution, going into Black Lightning, was they took some of the really cool things about what they did in Daredevil, but the one problem with Daredevil is that, and it's not really a problem. They had some amazing fight scenes, but they didn't go to the extreme. But they didn't really distinguish the fighters as well as I felt like Black Lightning did.
Sure,
right?
Sure.
And but I think that's something that we only think of after we get to, again. I think that there's sort of you know, it's about paradigm shifts, right?
Right.
You know, they shifted the paradigm with these amazing scenes. And in fact, I always felt like in that one, they shifted the paradigm in such a way that that's part of what destroyed Iron Fist.
Yes, because well, in that regard, like they tried to establish that difference of fighting style. Matt could fight, right? Like we know that without question. Jessica and Luke were more of the brawlers,
right?
And then here comes, you know, Danny, who's supposed to be able to fight to a level that's even better than Matt. But he wasn't as good as Matt, and that was part of the problem.
He wasn't as good as Luke or Jessica.
I mean, I was trying to be polite, but you're absolutely
right. So, all right, we're taking a defender segue.
My daughter saw the first fight scene with Iron Fist and barred me from ever wearing my Iron Fist T-shirt again.
Yikes!
Guys, unfortunately, I think the actor that did that role didn't know that he was actually being made a stooge of. In other words, I think that was intentional.
Okay.
I really do. Okay. I think they wanted to make him the white rich spoiled foil. And you know, they
did that really well.
The cage. I mean, I gotta admit, I gotta feel the guy wouldn't have let himself be duped that way. Playing that role and just not, I mean, anyway.
But I read some articles where like one of the internal arguments on that set was that he wasn't doing his practicing,
right?
Like that he wasn't putting in the effort, and they had to do a lot of stuff around his inability to be able to pretend to be able to fight.
Right. So I mean, we're talking in a world post Matrix where those guys went in for months to get through the level of I can do this that we saw. And yes, there are hardcore martial arts, you know, practitioners that are like, they're trash, but they still put in the work to get to the level where these guys are like, you're trash. As opposed to, you know, in Iron Fist, they're like, this isn't even trash. This is less than that.
This is pre-60s. I mean, writing was bad.
This is bad. But to bring it back to Jupiter's Legacy, the thing that got me was,
before I was banned from wearing my Iron Fist T-shirts, which I had two of.
Okay,
it's the green one with the Iron Fist. I mean,
right?
My daughter's reaction was to say, "This doesn't even count as bad dancing."
No. And to be honest, I wear my Iron Fist T-shirt because in testament to what they did to that kind of character. I think
that's fair.
On purpose. You can't take a rich white billionaire kid who got his powers through accident with no work, suddenly become a hero amidst Jessica Jones, Luke Cage, and you know, Matt, you can't have that.
It's not gonna work. It's not gonna work.
And they brought him in so they could do the Defenders, but they laughed at him the whole time.
The whole time. It was bad.
That's what they did. So Victor, you were talking about Jupiter's Legacy. Yeah.
Okay, so in terms of the fight, like prowess of things, Jupiter's Legacy is illustrated for the most part by Frank Quitely, who is one of my favorite comic book artists of all time. And what Frank is really great at when it comes to visual storytelling are different effects that actually tell you huge amounts of story without necessarily showing you the direct action, but usually the aftermath. And so when it came to the fight choreography, that was something that I thought we were going to see more of, is what is a Frank Quitely fight in actual real time. So in that regard, and it's some of the smartest things I've ever seen, where again, when it comes to comics, there's certain things that we can show, certain things that we can't show. We understand that the literal moment of impact is the weakest moment of an action, right? If you look at somebody punching, if you were to stop at the point where fist actually makes contact with face, everyone is in their most prone state. It looks like there's no energy there whatsoever because it's just this stopping point, right?
Yeah.
Right.
So with Frank, who is an expert at showing the reactionary power of something, I thought that was what we were going to get more of, where you don't actually have to spend a huge ton on fight choreography if you make the reaction to this thing that much more powerful. You know, if you see somebody wind up and the next thing you see is somebody flying off screen, that's huge. You're like, oh my God, that person's got punched to the moon, but you never had to see it. You didn't have to risk that. Wow, you know, it's an understood. And that's the thing that I think we lost, visually speaking, when it comes to the fight choreography of Jupiter's Legacy. This had a blueprint to it. And if you read the books, one of my favorite moments, there's a scene where a character, I won't spoil anything, a character shows up and their transition to getting to this space is all reactionary spots. It's them flying so fast, but everyone else is reacting to them, their flyover. And we don't even see them. Like that's absolutely irrelevant. That's the thing that I thought we were going to get that we didn't, that I was really low-key disappointed with.
No, that would have been very cool because it's basically the transfer of energy, right?
Yes.
What happens next? Exactly. So guys, I never read the comics. I went into this show confusing it with Jupiter Ascending. I was sort of expecting that kind of, vibe. And I have to say, as I got into it more, as they told the two timelines in the same episodes over, I did come to appreciate it more. So I'll tell you the things that stuck out to me. One is the invoking of Lovecraft, which happened pretty early. That's a dangerous proposition anymore. You have to know who you're talking about. And I bought into it. Okay, they're going to go into the Bermuda Triangle. That does look, those mountains do look kind of like at the Mountains of Madness. Oh yeah, all those big stone things. Yeah, okay, they were getting there. But there's no Lovecraft payoff. And if you're going to write about Lovecraft these days, you have to talk about his racism. You just have to. And they addressed racism in certain areas of the text in the show. And but what I was confused by was there's no shown about what the code is. I mean, the code is words, right? We don't govern and we don't kill. And those are, but show me that. I mean, why? The thing is, he's sitting there in one of those episodes and, Dark Star's got his kid and I'm like, no, you're not going to let you sit. You're as I said in the last episode, I think we live in a gradient of violence, right? The closer it is to us, the more likely we're. So I haven't seen what are the stakes in the code. And I haven't seen why the code became so important to him. And I felt like they were relying on, I'll just say tropes, right? In that case, too much, because I went through all those episodes and I didn't want to see just how they became superheroes. I wanted to see why there's so much conflict between them now, all around this idea of a code. And so I don't know if that's going to play out. Like I said, I haven't read the comics. I don't know if that plays out later. But I really hope so, because when you just say people do what they do because of these simple thoughts, you just kind of start removing the nuance and the gray from the narrative. And so,
well, what struck me about the code is that it actually represents probably the first two dilemmas that you would encounter when you have that kind of power, no matter when you get it, right? And I think you're right. Like there are so many ways in which they could have shown it. I mean, and I also find it hard to believe that it took, what is it, almost 100 years for a good guy with powers to kill somebody. I mean, what are the odds on that? Like
how do you practice using that force and not having it be lethal? I mean,
right. But you go through a period of time where you got to figure it out. Like in the whole thing about not governing. I mean, I actually was hoping to see in that earlier time some sort of storyline where we see why they decide not to do that. And it didn't have to even be one of the heroes killing. It could have been it could have been a villain killing, and then be like, holy crap, like,
yeah,
so I thought I agree with you on that. I also think that I think it's very easy to just to conflate the comic and the show. Mm-hmm. I personally think that one of the duties of doing an adaptation of a comic is to bring it out of the time that it's in and make it work in the time that it's being released. Mm-hmm. So when I talk about areas in which I didn't feel like they brought it up to our time, I'm not critiquing the comic. I'm critiquing the choices that were made in translating the comic to a film, because all of the great television shows, miniseries, movies about superheroes, one of the things that they do really well is they translate the narrative in the comic into the cultural moment of the release of the media product.
So what's really interesting as a fan of the books and a fan of the show is the understanding of what sort of things they were doing. Okay, so one, Mark is a genius when it comes to his perspective on adaptations of his comic book work. His whole mindset, and I have adopted this, and I implore anybody that is a creative to adopt the exact same mentality. The perfect version that you want to tell is the book that you make. If somebody wants to pay you to tell their version of your thing that may or may not be as good, let them. Like, go for it. It doesn't change what you did, right?
Right.
So in a lot of ways, I see Mark being very supportive, but at the same time, very hands-off and not saying, well, you shouldn't do this or you shouldn't do that. If somebody presented something to him, he goes, cool, good job. You did a thing. Awesome. I'm not trying to direct you one way or the other from, adherence to what's on the page, because what I put on the page is what I wanted on the page. What you want to put on the screen, that's got to be up to you. And I think he allowed that. What is really cool to me is I think this show told 3 stories at the same time. You had the modern time, you had the past time, and then you had a metatextual story about the tropes of comics and how those things clashed, right? We have, so like the code is purely a trope. It's a tropic concept because it's to explain why history as we understand it is supposed to have moved forward with these great, powerful beings in existence. That is one of the biggest problems of any relatability of comics to the real world, is there are things that happen that clearly these superheroes should have not only stopped, intervened, reversed, all of that stuff. And the last time that we saw this happen was Amazing Spider-Man number 36, the black cover issue that happened right after 9/11. That was like a time where they actually used the comic to metatextually talk about the fact that we're not real. If we were real, that would be great because we would have stopped this, or we would have been there, and this is how we would have felt about it. But the truth is they're not real. So when you have characters that literally can tip the world, how do you explain all the different things that have happened historically? Because you're wanting that to be rooted in the real world. How does that happen with these people in existence? World War II happened and Superman existed.
Right.
How? He has to set a limitation for himself as to what his level of involvement is going to be and to what, extent.
Yeah.
And that's what they're playing up. That's what the code is this very mocked, because it's again, the idea that at the time when these characters were created, good was good. Obviously good is good and you're going to do the right thing. And this is just what you do. And as we've gotten more mature as an audience, as we've gotten more mature as creatives, we know the truth is, no, we wouldn't. No, we would not. And how do you juxtapose that difference? You actually make this arbitrary code concept that one guy who seemingly is the most powerful out of everybody demands and almost like brutish dictators, tells everybody you have to adhere to this. But the idea is I'm forcing you to adhere to a neutrality because we couldn't justify history happening as it did if we weren't, which is one of the greatest things. Like when you take Jupiter's Legacy and juxtapose that against Watchmen, that becomes totally brilliant because Watchmen has a different history. Yes. You invoke these guys, history turns totally in a different way because it would. And that's what I think, this code is supposed to represent, is the idea that we know this early format of superheroes that these guys are supposed to come from is absolutely silly. We know that. There's no way it would work. There's no way that people would adhere to it. That's not it. But juxtapose that with the modern age, the Iron Age, if you will, the Bronze Age or whatever, of comic characters where they're more inclined to be like, you know what? I fought you one time too many. You got to go.
Yeah,
you got to go. If I don't kill you now, whoever you kill next is my fault. That's not a mindset that they had Golden Age story-wise. They didn't look at that way. So this is that conversation. This is that metatextual conversation of look at how we've changed in terms of what we accept as heroic in the things that we do. There was a time when you put on a cape and you just do all the right things because you have the cape. You're just going to do right. We know this. But now it's like, nah, you live in this world and this world is shit. And you're going to react that way.
I mean, and I'll be honest, that's why, because this is coming before, why I'm really fascinated with power fantasies, right? With what this, and that's ultimately what the superhero genre is. It's a recitation on people try to say it's conservative or liberal. I actually move against that. But it is rooted in this idea that power is best exercised if it's put in the hands of an individual unmoored from the state.
Right.
And so we see all the things that spin out of that. It actually is this idea that power doesn't corrupt. It's the idea that power will corrupt the state before it will corrupt the individual. And so I actually get very optimistic in that way. Right.
Right.
But what I think is also interesting is what that means in terms of agency and also constituency, right? That even though Spider-Man is not connected to the state, he's still got a constituency. He's got the people who he's ultimately the hero of. And so what I love about the code, it is the same thing that you're talking about, Victor, that it's like it explains how certain things work. But the problem is translating the code into our current moment. So the code is actually applied in a way that really makes sense in the 30s and 40s.
Right.
And they're doing
which is the metatextual conversation that they're having. Right. Like your code was good back then. But now, no, like your code is outdated and we need to move forward.
I'm not talking about in that term. I'm talking about in terms of what I said earlier about how you translate a story into the now, right?
Oh, I got you.
So in an era post, so one of the things that happened with Watchmen is that they looked at it and they pretty much understood that like Watchmen does not work at all today as a story in terms of how we talk about identity. It's not just how we talk about blackness, but also how we talk about whiteness, right? It doesn't work. It actually kind of falls apart because it rests on this idea that in the face of power, everyone just unites. But what the original, the Watchmen comic, kind of didn't quite understand is that in the face of that power, right, is that power over time is experienced so radically differently that like the fact that we talk about power as being racialized, it's really a reference to how differentially we experience power, and how differentially power is used. So like power as a uniting function like that, it doesn't quite work. And we also saw that with 9/11. So what happens in this is, it's like we have the code. I actually love that idea that we have a code that says we don't govern, right? But in today's, so once you get to today, the problem is that there's an audience, is that when you start looking at the promises that stories make, right? The moment you say we don't govern, it gets translated in our current cultural context as also a promise to explain, well, how the hell do you enforce that? And they never really talk about it. What happens is they have an event that happens, then everyone's like, oh my God. But it doesn't make sense that you could go for 100 years and never once have to enforce it, right? And that's where it starts to really fall apart. But it's falling apart really early, and that's kind of the issue. So like in a post, in today's time, it's like there are certain demands on that story. Like it could, that it needs to satisfy to really work for the audience.
Now, I gotta give a little, not pushback, but context, I'll call it. The reason why for almost 100 years it wasn't a problem is because the amount of super people that there was very small. It was very small. They only started having kids within the last 20 something years, right? So it's only been like 8 or 9 of them with this level of power, which makes it very easy to manage when one of them, the one who's designating that this code exists, is the most powerful one. It's like if Superman was the one to say, this is our code. If you break it, you got to deal with me. There's only so many characters that even could do it. So mostly everybody would just abide because they couldn't rationally fight him. You know what I mean? Like
but even in that context, right? There had to be moments in those 100 years where
they clashed for sure. But that was the thing, is like he would interject and they would back off because
but the weakness of the story is the weakness of the story is ultimately we needed to see that. That's not something that could be left as being inferred. And I also go, the next step is that in terms of how they dealt with identity, this would have been fine around in the Iron Man 1 era, right? But today, no.
So look, I want to talk about both what you guys are saying about the code, and as I was listening to Victor talk about the intertextuality of what this code is, for me, as you were talking, I experienced that more and more as kind of like a mode barrier. And what I mean by that is, how am I going to experience this narrative? Am I going to experience these characters as individual agents, and I've got to tell a narrative about how they decide? And the code then is kind of, like I said earlier, a cognitive thing they use to sort of dictate how they act. Or is the code that you mentioned, how I as a viewer manage experiencing this all as poetry in terms of these are all forces within all of us, versus or experiencing them all as individual agents. And the code, when you say, we don't govern, we don't kill, that provides me a space where I can experience it poetically, or I can experience it in terms of some agency. And what I, if I can carry that a little further, the idea that there was a code earlier that worked. This is why I was a little disappointed with where they went with Lovecraft, because that's exactly what the Watchmen unpacked. What the Watchmen unpacked is, there may have been a code that worked, and life may have felt simple because a certain group was in charge. As Stanford says, the constituency had the power. And what Watchmen did was deconstruct that power in terms of, it wasn't black and white. It may have looked black and white to you. It may have seemed like there was a code to you, but our lives, that wasn't the case. And so I that's why when I saw the Lovecraft, I think, oh, they're going to play a little Watchmen thing here, right? They're going to deconstruct the lives that, because they keep going back to saying how great it was, you know, pre-depression. And I don't think it was great for everyone. And I don't think it was black and white. So anyway, I just wanted to say that code.
No, that's a very, very wise point. And what's interesting is that the books, they have a limit to how much they actually talk about that particular era. They don't get into that a lot. So the show really did take a huge liberty in that front. Okay. Because in the books, what we're set up with is, yes, Sheldon and his brother were affected gravely by the market crash in the 1920s. Right. Sheldon is still looked at from everybody as this very prominent, pivotal figure. When he says, we go. Like that's the mode that they showcase for everybody. There's a sense of trust in what Sheldon says. If he believes it, you might as well, you could bank on it because it's real. That's him. What's really like kind of interesting is the aspects of the struggle beyond that they do gloss over. In fact, even the concept of the Lovecraftian stuff is very glossed over because all we know from the books is that they go to the island and when they come back, they have power. We don't know how, we don't know, like the only concept of the why is Sheldon's position as we were here to save the country. And historically speaking, as America on the global stage was saved, while not for the individuals in many experiences, but the greater whole, that's what they're for. And that's what they kind of represent. But then what happens when America changes and then the next generation of these guys come along and they don't have the same reverence for this national idea that their parents did? It becomes something, you know, very, very different. And the other thing that I love about this, that again, you see the difference between the book and the show, just like Stanford was saying, the translation is different. The book is taking place at a time where we're talking about economic recessions, different issues like that. And Brainwave, the older brother, is meeting with the government to talk about how to fix it. And Sheldon shows up and is like, I need you to step outside. And he's like, well, I'm in a meeting. And he's like, step outside right now. And when they go outside, he's like, you know, we're not supposed to do this. And he's like, well, they came to me and they want this and that. And he's like, you know, we are not supposed to do that. That's their job. We are not supposed to do this. And I've told you before, don't make me tell you again, we're not getting involved. And I think the most genius part of this is when you look at the character superhero names, it actually fits. Sheldon is the utopian. He is this great ideal that affects everybody. Lady Liberty, again, the idea of freedom affects everybody. Brainwave, that's singular. That's one direct person. You know what I mean? Yeah. So in terms of their positions to everybody else, this is why. Some of them aim to speak for everyone, while others aim to speak for self. And Sheldon and oh God, I just lost his wife's name. But the way that they operate in the greater context of perspective for everybody, this is why they set the code. And this is why they're the ones that get to almost dictate to everyone else, because our view is actually bigger just by the nature of our names. And it even pairs down to their son in the show, Paragon. That's singular. That's an internal singular designation. I'm the best, as opposed to Utopian. What is best for everybody? That's that they are playing on so many amazing little storytelling pieces as to the context of that idea, but it doesn't necessarily translate as well to the show. And you're absolutely right in that.
You know, I mean, one thing that kind of struck me, and this is was Sheldon's character, who he was in the Great Depression, right? Like, it is very clear that he is politically a very left of center liberal, surrounded by conservatives.
Yes.
Everything about him is that. And that there's also a political divide in terms of him and his older brother. Like his older brother, I have to run stuff. I have like how he thinks about the greater good is fundamentally different, you know, and then, you know, how they, you know, it's like, and so when I talk about identity, I'm just not talking about like the Black character, which I think is a whole other thing that things we're talking about, but
who is not in the book that way. I just want you to know that, like, that is definitely something that they changed for the show.
Exactly, but they changed. But ironically, the way they changed it actually made it worse for the storytelling. You know, I agree with that. But what's interesting is Sheldon's statement about not governing actually creates more conflict for somebody who has his views than somebody who has his older brother's views. That's the irony in all of this, and they don't talk about that. Like if you're Sheldon, and they've pretty much established, I'm the guy who really thinks that everybody needs to be equal. I'm the guy who is optimistic. I'm the guy who believes that everybody should have a place at the table. Damn, like a civil rights movement?
Right.
I mean, every time he says we don't govern, he is basically pissing on his own ideas, views.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And so, you know, so anytime you encounter something that's about a societal injustice, whether it's race, class, gender, he is literally pissing on his own views. That's something that that would have made, if they had found a way, they only had to even deal with it like in like little segments. It could have been just little flashbacks. If they had inserted that into the Netflix series, it would have been transformative. Right, but the comics actually do deal with
exactly. And to that point, this is the part that is absolutely insane. You are 100% right. And I don't even know, like, have you read this yet?
No.
Okay, so
I've skimmed it, but I can't say that I've read it.
Here's the part that's crazy to me about how right you are. We had, in the actual order of publication, Jupiter's Legacy 1 was first, right? So this is Jupiter's Legacy 1, and you'll be hard pressed to find them in this way now. So what you would have to read in publication order, they're all listed as Jupiter's Legacy. You would have to read book 3 first, then go back to read what is now Jupiter's Legacy 1 and 2, which originally was called Jupiter's Circle, which is about them after the island over the next couple of decades. And exactly what you're talking about, we see Utopian doesn't uphold it. It's Skyfox who does. Skyfox is the one that, in terms of your wanting an example of the code being challenged, it's him.
Right.
He's the one that challenges it. Granted, it's not to, like, he doesn't necessarily kill people, but he's the one that actually goes super hard. And because the current Netflix series has been canceled, I will spoil just a little bit. I mean, in terms of what he challenges, we're talking J. Edgar Hoover. He challenges the civil rights movement, like the Watts riots. Skyfox shows up. The cops assume that he's there to help them put down the rioters, and he starts beating up the cops because he's like, what y'all are doing is wrong. And I'm helping the people, not you. And then he gets beat up by the rest of the team and put away in jail for the next 30, 40 years. You know, so like, you're absolutely, like, it's so amazing, because that's why I'm sorry, I had to stop. He's like, did you read this? Because you are literally dictating exactly what happens. Just the one person that you're saying should have done it is the one person who stops it.
Well, like, but it's interesting. Yeah. It's like, it's slightly inferred, and I'm also talking about it in relationship to the way they did it in the Netflix show.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, because the other thing that's interesting is that we find is that when we see Skyfox's son is mixed race, right? So we know. I mean, but when you look at their introduction, it's interesting because the guy who becomes Skyfox, I would say, I mean, politically, he's kind of in the middle. But he's also very much about an interpersonal politics.
Yes,
there's people he helps out people he likes. So it's actually really easy to imagine that type of future. If he likes you,
he'll help you.
Right, and he will. But he's also someone who his politics are incredibly local, and people whose politics are incredibly local become really interesting in the context of heroism, right? But still, utopia has a clearly or the utopian has a clearly defined politics. Mm-hmm. And I'm not saying that he would have fought and gone against his code against governing, but every time he went against his code against governing, that would be a time of stress for him. It wouldn't be just a thing of like, oh, well, we don't govern. It
we just
like,
don't.
It'd be like, shit.
Right. Well, see, I want to go back to what talk about what both of you are saying, because Victor, in your description of the characters, I was getting this idea of multiple scales of power, right? You have the utopian who has this basically kind of laser eye brute force power, right? That's what we've seen. And it, as you said, it's global power. It's the power you don't really wield in terms of individual milieu. You do, but it's about, we got to say big issues. And then, you've got his brother who's got his power as an individual power. I go into your mind and I shape how you think. And this is going to be my little take on what I see maybe Miller, the storytelling. I'm going to look at all these as metaphors, right? And I'm going to look at this as a sort of superhero driven Forrest Gump. And
yes,
in other words, who were we as baby boomers? Because you notice there's a reason all those generations are skipped. There's a reason utopia looks like a hippie, right? There's a reason why he can't understand his son. And I think there's an argument being made, not an argument, but it's an argument being shown to us about how the baby boomers feel about their past, right? And, we had big ideas. Right. And when we played with those big ideas, there are other things that happen poorly for others. And so when we try to get into the world, a lot of them ignored the world, i.e. the 80s and the 90s. And I just see this and I can't tell, like for me, I'm sorry, Forrest Gump is a fun movie to watch, but I thought it was a little bit of we're not to blame. The Forrest Gump character for me was I'm blameless. All I wanted to do was make a better world. And
he didn't even want that.
Exactly.
He just wanted to see Jenny.
Exactly.
And everything happens.
Exactly. Kind of like
and
Billy Joel's
box of chocolates.
Yeah.
Right.
Kind of like Billy Joel's We Didn't Start the Fire, right? And there's just a list of all these things we're not responsible for. I'm not trying to be negative on here. What I'm saying is that identity issue is still very much, oh my God, it's been running our politics in this country for 10, 30 years. And some call them the dorm fights of the 60s, right? But I just see this show is really sort of expressing that boomer tension. And looking at it that way, they're still struggling with power, right?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. I mean, we all do. But and looking at it that way, I just wanted to throw it out there. For me, it's kind of
that's fantastic.
For Forrest Gump, stuff.
Well, and what's really interesting to me is in the books, there's a moment where we actually see what Sheldon does for a living, which we either he doesn't do it in the show or we just don't see it. But he actually runs like a automobile repair shop. Like,
I thought you were going to tell me he runs for a month.
No. Like he literally like does like car repairs and in some old dusty looking, off the beaten path car shop. And we see it where a character shows up there where they're supposed to have a conversation and he's like, what's wrong with an honest day's work? So he's like borderline super proletariat with the way that he does things, where he's like, look, I think that there's this greater thing that we're supposed to be doing, but we still gotta keep things running on a small level. We're just not supposed to invoke our power on a big level. And basically looking at it by saying like, the only reason why anybody would listen to me in government is because I'm the utopian, but that's not a good enough reason for them to listen to me. And that right there, I'm like, that's a brilliant conversation right there.
But it's also kind of ironic when you think about it, right? I mean, as you were talking about, I hadn't thought about this before, is that that's kind of the privilege of his power, right?
Yes.
So, because when you look at Brainwave, before he had powers, he
had responsibility, man.
Everything about him was about responsibility, and it was all about pursuits of the mind. And so Sheldon the code was designed for Sheldon. It's designed for somebody who is able to, like Sheldon.
Who has enough
Sheldon,
privilege to be able to sit around having deep thoughts?
Well, not just that. It's that. Like that. It's right. What you just said. No one would ask Sheldon to govern if he didn't have the powers, right? So right. Sheldon is not sacrificing any of his pre-power gifts or his pre-power life. Now, somebody who, if you look at the story, Sheldon's older brother would have been asked to help govern and was being asked to help govern and was participating in helping to govern before this. Right. So it's kind of like the code itself has a very, very different impact on him. Like, because we tend to focus on the not killing and the not governing in connection with killing. Because when we were talking about not governing in terms of like, you're not going to take over a country, that makes sense. But, Sheldon still gets to repair cars. Sheldon, in relationship to the business, he was not the person making the tough decisions about how to run a business, right? Mm-hmm. So like he wasn't really stepping back from anything. And
you see, for me, that what I experience that as a sort of take on privilege, in the sense that this is what you all say to each other at dinner parties to feel good about the fact that you're so damn wealthy. Now, we're not going to talk about, Walt's life when we're out in the world. We're going to talk about the big, bold world that we're doing good to make. Mm-hmm. And I'm not trying to diss the character. What I think we're seeing is the tensions in that privilege. How do you be that wealthy and still respect yourself? Mm-hmm. Well, you build libraries, right? You give lots of money to people, and all of that is in the name of actually sustaining the infrastructure that continues to keep you wealthy. That's how I experience that brother tension, and the fact that what we see in the end with the betrayal. That's where, I'm sorry, but that's where our generation is right now. Damn, man, trillions of dollars are about to be generationally passed on in this culture.
Yep.
And then it's going to become the public story in the next 20, 30 years.
Yep.
It's a story. Yep. No one is talking about it. I'm not going to say no one, but what we're seeing is the volume on that conversation is going up as kids got to take out a mortgage to go to college, which I never had to do. Mm-hmm. Right, as the wealth gap continues to increase and people come to understand why, and they're just going to see all that money go by. Mm-hmm. That tension, I think, is what drives the betrayal in the end. That breaks that identity that those three guys represent. What do I do for myself? What do I do for my kids? What do I do for the world? Well, I got hoarded cash here, so how do I think I liked the show. I really wish they hadn't introduced Lovecraft, that they weren't going to lean into it. But nonetheless, I liked the tensions that they're expressing. And I didn't know they weren't getting a second series, because I would feel that these things that we're talking about, would be things that would flesh out would be worth fleshing out.
Definitely. I do implore you to read the series. As it is, there's a third sequel that's just started. It's called Jupiter's Legacy Requiem. Issue 1 is out now. Issue 2, I think, comes out in like 2-3 weeks. So definitely check that out. It's going to be a 12-issue series, and that one actually gets more into the why they got powers and what this was actually supposed to do. So yeah,
that's I think it's interesting because it's like, also back to how you describe how like certain characters are individuals and other characters are ideas, right? And thinking about what you're talking about, Scott, in terms of intergenerational sense of betrayal, right? One thing that struck me is like, even as you're talking about it, I was thinking, it's like, what does this code mean to each person, right? And that's something that I also need to see more, because it was like as you're talking, I started to think, it's like, wow, so this code has a real differential impact on each of these people. Like imagine a code, and it's like Stanford, you don't get to read those books over there, but you didn't like reading those books anyway, right?
Well, you are in the Garden of Eden, man. I mean, come
right,
on.
you know,
I mean,
Victor, you don't get to use that blue cup to drink from, right?
Right.
Scott, you don't get to teach.
Right. Right.
No, but I'm saying it's like that's how differential this code is if you start looking at who these people were before, right?
Yeah.
But then you carry it through, and you know, we're kind of obsessing about our own generations, right? The baby boomers, Generation X. But like, what does this mean to the millennials? And that's the other thing that we haven't really talked that much about is like what I thought was interesting about this. It was actually something that happened in one of the trailers that wasn't included in the actual story, which was, did you see the trailer or the teaser they had where it was actually, where it actually showed the superhero kids being trained?
Yes. And we didn't see that. Yeah.
Like, I think honestly, I needed to see that because when we see the kids, it's like they are acting like a whole bunch of people who went to high school together, where you see their own little cliques and people have relationships that transcend where they are now, right? I wanted to see a little more of that because it would have been nice to also be able to look at that code and to be able to kind of process it in terms of, oh, well, you know, it would affect this person differently than that person. Like we can figure out how it differentially affects the older characters, but we were not given much insight at all to how it differentially affects the younger characters. See, other than them taking a position, but we weren't seeing the individualized effects.
That's definitely something that the book does a much better job of, if not exploring, at least hinting at, because they make the determination or very specific designation that the older generation sought power. That's how they got it. They had to go do a couple of things, and that's how they got power. But these kids were born with power. They never asked for this. And now they're being held to a standard, which is interesting because in the show, Brandon is more like his dad, or is aiming to be like his dad. In the books, neither him nor Chloe want the superhero life. They are not like they are absolute shite when it comes to being superheroes. That Brandon doesn't have a superhero name. He's not called Paragon. He's Brandon. And it's a very different thing where they're like, in reference to the code, you guys asked for this. We didn't. Why are you holding us to a standard that we never asked for? Yes. You put this on us. Yeah. And it almost plays into the notion of why it took them so long before they had kids, as though having kids or not having kids was a part of the code. You know, it was something that you couldn't do because they didn't know how it was going to affect everybody until they got to a point, and it took 100 years, maybe 80, 90 years before someone did it. And then they're like, well, all right, now what do we say? You know, the code probably did change just a little bit in that regard. Not only could you not take a life, you couldn't make a life, but things happened. And based on the book and what I know of the books, as messed up as it is, as selfish as it might be, it was when Utopian and Lady Liberty got together. I think that's what really changed a lot. The books is different. The books are different. You know, the books, some have kids before those two are even a couple. But in the show, I think that is an undercurrent thing. Once they decided they were going to be a couple and have kids, the code changed. And
I'll be honest, in spite of some of my ambivalence about this, I really wanted to. I would have been one of the first people to watch the second season.
Oh yeah.
You know, because
that feeling grew as the season went on for me.
Yeah,
I think it got better and better.
Yeah. You know, I mean, we haven't really talked much about it, but I also think that there does bear a little more discussion of how did they fumble the ball on race?
Man.
Like, I mean, and I'm not saying, and here's the thing, they did, I'm not saying that they didn't have diversity, they did, but it was like, I felt like I was reading a racial narrative that wouldn't have even necessarily worked in 2013. And so I can't put any of this on the comic book, right? I mean, I have to, you know, I mean, you know, I mean, they had diversity there, but the characters were just, but the characters and the racial identity was just totally marginal to the plot. And actually, by having the characters there, it actually made it feel a little worse to me.
Yeah. The thing is, like I said, early on when they mentioned Lovecraft, I thought, oh, okay, they're going to try to Watchmen this thing. And then they didn't. And then all the things that you said happened. And I thought, maybe they're going to go meta on themselves in season 2 and recount what that code meant in the 30s, right? And so maybe they'll set some stuff up here, and then they'll recurse on themselves, you know. But they didn't set up anything that would question how they managed race in this season, which kind of makes me have to just agree with you. And then to see, you know, I suspect they were in production and having had seen Lovecraft Country, having had seen Watchmen, and not, hey, shit, man. Yes, of course. We're going to say Lovecraft, and oh my God, you know, all these things. I'm not going to say they should have popped. What I'm going to say is my experience of it was, it's not there.
Right.
They could have or tried to put it there, but if it had found, just to critique itself, man, to set something up in season 1 so that, like, you know, wait a minute, what do you mean the code was good back then?
Right.
And then come back to season 2 and tell how, oh Lord, there's a whole world out there we aren't talking about.
This is definitely indicative of the writing staff of the show having an intention and an aim that's different than what I think Mark had. This sounds crazy, okay? I know it sounds crazy. Mark was wise to have everybody that went to the island be white in this book. That's wise, because in the 1930s, if you weren't a servant, there's no way you're going with these supposedly rich white people. Like, no, that's not happening. Like, the idea of really black people having superpowers at that time would have been an act of aggression. They would, no, you can't do that. In fact,
which is what the Watchmen got perfect.
Exactly.
Right.
You cannot do this because of how you look. No, we won't accept it. We don't want it. That's true. Again, Marvel Comics has shown that multiple times with Isaiah Bradley as a character, with Blue Marvel as a character. There's realistic points in time where a person of color having power would not be accepted. There is nothing that you can say that would change that truth. That is a truth, hardcore fact. So again,
and we know it because we had this movement that like, I don't know, inspired gun control called the Black Power movement.
Say it.
You know, so we don't, so we live in a country that's uncomfortable with the word black and power being in the same sentence, to the point where we will pass legislation. Right. I think that you're right. I think that what would have been interesting is if they had kept it, they could have really talked about the excesses of privilege and the responsibilities of privilege. But as we were talking about this, and what the racial narrative really brings out is that one of the things that a good superhero comic does incredibly well is deconstruct a code.
Yes.
And so let's think about this, right? Like, think of how much of Superman's stories center around his code against killing. Think of how much of Batman's stories center around his code against killing, both of which they say the same things, but are very different in terms of how they're operationalized, right? Think about Spider-Man. With great power comes great responsibility, right? And so to have a story, a superhero story that is about a code, but doesn't do it as well as these superhero stories that aren't necessarily about the code, but just have a code there. It kind of undercuts itself. And then when you start getting into things like the one black person with powers we see walking around, you know, from the original set, is in a wheelchair, right?
Yeah.
So they've literally neutered him from the start.
Wait. Let me give you a little something that makes that even worse. That character in the series leaves his wife and family at a certain point for a younger person. So now you've made the black superhero a deadbeat dad. Good job, guys. Like, if you carry over any sort of storytelling beats, why would you make that guy the black guy? Like, look at what you're gonna say. They're not even thinking that far ahead to say, this is what we're gonna say.
I mean, the black guy, what would have worked well with this would have been making the black guy Sky Fox.
Right.
So so look, I want to go back to Victor's comment about Miller only sending white people to the island. I think if that's what he did, then their translation botched it, because only sending white people to the island could be a comment on race. Period.
Absolutely.
You have to look at it, right?
The Great White Hope, of course.
Of course. And then what happens is we can then experience, as I did, to be honest, this narrative as a struggle of white identity. I really do experience, and I have to admit, it's told from the perspective of the boomers, and so I see that playing out, and that would have also given them an easy option to just throw some lines in, like, well, why were there only white people on that island? That could just be a line that comes out in the later episodes in season 1 that they then deconstruct in season 2. And so I think, and since they didn't do that, it just, for me, amplifies Stanford's point of just the sort of token representation that they were doing. If you're going to do it at a level of depth like they did in the Watchmen, or as you're saying, Victor, like Miller did in the book.
When you start talking about tokenism, they essentially made the black character the character that was the least consequential,
right,
in terms of the story they were telling.
Right.
Yeah, and what does he do? He saves the mind guy.
Yeah.
I mean,
in terms of, like the book's twist on the betrayal is so much better because it's faster. It's a lot faster. Like, we're talking book 1 of the trade paperback series. That betrayal happens here. Like, it's in there super quick. And it's one that the scale of the betrayal becomes exactly what we're all talking about. The generational conversation, the idea of the code, one person wielding power over everyone, and everyone having dissenting opinions about it, but not being able to voice it until like something changes the power dynamic, because that's always what it's about. They openly say the reason why Utopian is adhered to is because no one has the power to challenge him. Like, that's the bottom line. If it comes down to it, if we have to fight him over this new idea, we don't have the power to do it until someone does. And in that regard, now we can have this conversation. But even then, it's not a conversation. Right. It is an outright rebellion against what you've said. And it's played so damn well in this book that, while I did enjoy many parts of the show, it's not as good as the book. And
I gotta tell you what, if you're gonna have a betrayal, I have to feel like you earned it.
Yeah.
You have to, there has to be some major mojo shift in the narrative that, oh my God, I see things so differently now. And it's not just because someone else did it. It's because there's a whole structure in the narrative world that changes. And I just didn't get that with this betrayal at the end.
And betrayal needs to happen, not because, you're right. You can't have betrayal happen because, someone's just a bad guy. Right.
Right.
I mean,
yeah.
Betrayal is, to be honest, I think betrayal is best when it's completely understandable.
Yes. Well, to be honest, I kind of sort of understood Sky Fox's betrayal. A little bit.
Sky Fox. Okay. So here's my issue though.
All right.
Sky Fox's betrayal wasn't a betrayal.
Yes.
Yeah, Sky Fox's betrayal was not a betrayal. Sky Fox decided, I'm done with standing on the sidelines when I have a different opinion.
Yes, exactly right.
You know, if it comes down to where I'm not strong enough to fight you, so be it.
Yeah.
Fuck it. The answer is I'm going to stand against.
Yeah.
I don't care.
Yeah.
That I will win. I don't care that you will beat me. Yeah. I'm going to stand up for what's right because that's what's right. Period.
Yeah.
That's why Sky Fox is my favorite character out of this series, aside from who Chloe becomes. And it's that idea of, even in the face of literal imminent destruction. I mean, this is so crazy. If there's 1% chance, you got to take it with 100% certainty. Sky Fox is that guy that's like, I'm going to stand in the way. I don't care that you're bigger than me, stronger than me, faster than me. I'm standing in the way because either you're going to move me and I'm going to affect you because you had to move me, or I'm going to affect you and you won't even try. Like, but either way, I'm here. I'm here. I am the obstacle from your totalitarian point of view.
Yeah,
that's like the great moment of conflict, right?
Yeah.
You know, somebody with power standing up for civil rights, and then somebody who believes in civil rights crushing that power
and not even realizing what they did.
Yeah.
And I actually think it's more interesting because they do realize what they did. It's just that they decided that this idea of not governing was bigger than bigger than this idea of standing up for what was right.
You're getting into Dark Knight Returns territory, man. I like it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's, to me, that's where things get really interesting, right? And it's not about saying, you know, it feeds into a lot of what Scott's talking about how do you deal with this type of intergenerational conflict, because part of it comes from not a difference in belief, but a difference in the prioritizing of the line items in that belief, right?
Yeah.
You know, we believe it, you know, it's like I, you know, believing in free expression. Well, okay, we can all believe in free expression, but what happens if it's your politics versus my church? Right. Like these are the classic things, and then you add power on top of it, where we already see the winners.
Yeah.
Like, and so that means that people have to be aware that their expression of power, right? See that moment where Utopian goes up against Sky Fox over civil rights. What it would mean is that is a decision to govern.
Yeah. I mean, right? and if you take all this to its logical conclusion, hopefully one of the things that happens we recognize is there is no such thing as not governing.
As neutrality. No.
There is no such thing.
You exist. Right? Therefore, there is
Yeah. And when you have that type of power, you know, you don't just shift things by exercising the power. You also shift things by not exercising the power.
Well, and
you tell people it's okay when you won't fight them.
And it's also, again, continuously diagnostic of a certain way of living where you think there's a thing called governing. You think there's a thing called education. You think there's a thing called healthcare, and you really think they're different, right? That they're not all influencing each other, and they're not all part of everything we do. And when you can have those big ideas, the big code, for me, what that does is actually get you looking off at a big thing so that you don't have to pay attention to all the real, what we called earlier, the little things that are really happening that are life, right? And so, you know, for me, when you're in those positions of privilege, you see these narratives come up. And what they do is they keep people sane, because I've got all this wealth, all this power, and I know why I have it, but I can't afford to have a narrative that lets me know that, right? So my narrative is I'm good. And just to continue it, there's so many rhetorics out there right now that are doing the same thing. What they're doing is providing what I call a cognitive deflection away from what's really going on so that I can feel good about myself. right? And to keep the machine moving. And so no, I started babbling a little bit there.
No. It's solid. It's solid. Where, you know, the truth is these guys had the power to stop the flow and build a better machine. They were choosing to, you know, maintain a status quo that in truth may not have been what they were supposed to maintain. They put things back on the table as it was supposed to be. But what if you weren't supposed to do that? What if you were given this power and ability to literally make change and you didn't? You did cosmetics. You know, that's the beautiful, you know, question of the whole series right there. And I think that's the stuff that we're going to get in Requiem, which is generations removed that look back and go, you guys screwed up. You guys didn't do nearly what you were supposed to do. Like, y'all didn't even see what you were setting up. And you thought you had all this insight and clarity, and you didn't know nothing. Good job. Good job.
I really hope that's what he does, because honestly, I think that truly is the story we're living in right now. Is this not just, it's just a reckoning across multiple scales. And when you were speaking there, Victor, I was thinking, what have we done progressively since the civil rights movement? Right? I mean, what happened to that? Well, that's Skyfox.
That is 100%.
That is 100%. The Loki in Asgard's privilege.
Yes. And even to the point where, like, in this new iteration, we're playing on the idea of superpowered people that aren't superheroes or villains. Yes. Like, what does that actually look like when they're people? Like, one guy is an athlete. What does that look like? Should he not be an athlete because he has abilities, powers, or whatever? And he's like, screw y'all, I am an athlete. Like, this is what I want to do. Well, how come you're not saving the day? Because I don't want to do that. Like, I don't want to jump out. No, I want to shoot free throws from Central Park. That's what I want to do. You know, Madison Square Garden, swat, because that's what I can do. Like,
hey man, they're doing that well in Invincible.
They are.
And I'm digging where I am. I don't know if I'm going to finish in the next month, but we'll definitely have to get back to that conversation.
Yes.
So I think we're getting ready to close it up here. Is there any sort of thing that you guys haven't been able to say about Jupiter's Legacy that you just want to get out there? I mean,
I think if you're a fan of, we definitely got into some goodness. I think if you look at the Miller World comics as one cohesive shared universe, you'll see the makings of something that is truly epic, that most people, when it was coming out, didn't understand the scale of what it was that they were seeing.
That's exciting. And you know why that's so exciting? I mean, what I love about where we are with media right now is it takes 10 hours, man. If you're going to show me and make me feel it and make me think it and make me feel the betrayal and the stakes, then you've just got to show it. It takes 10 hours.
Take the time. Yeah,
absolutely. And all right, that about wraps it up for this episode. Victor, why don't you tell everybody where they can find you on social media, and if you want anything you got going on these days?
Of course. You guys can find me at Vantage In-House on all forms of social media. We have a number of wonderful things that are popping off. I've got a Kickstarter that I'll be putting together shortly that will feature 2 issue 1s of a sequel series from the VIP Vantage In-House Phase 1 series. We're kicking off Phase 2 with this cool Kickstarter, so definitely look for that. And again, just follow me on all the things.
That's awesome. How about you, Stanford?
Well, you can reach me on social media. You can reach me on Twitter, Facebook, and Clubhouse at SW Carpenter.
Fantastic. You can find me on Twitter at dark_loops. And you can find all episodes of 3 Guys in a Story at the Dark Loops Productions channel on YouTube. You can also find me on YouTube if you just type in ReggieCon, all one word. It's a con being run at Illinois State University virtually, where we celebrate different diversity and heritage months with a discussion like we just did of pop culture. So there it is. From all of us to all of you, big hugs. And remember
the code.
Remember the code.
Remember the code.
Bye-bye.